Hello there, welcome once again to our science lesson. Remember, we have been looking at the large chapter, communities and environment, but we have said we have two types of environment, biotic, abiotic environment, and we are majorly now on biotic environment, the living organism, and we know that when living organisms live or they are found in an ecosystem, obvious they are going to interact, and the interaction is for their survival, as we have known. So during interaction, they usually produce or lead to special relationships. We have looked at several relationships like competition. We have also gone through parasitism, pollination, and others. So we want to move on to another type of relationship called symbiosis. Number 5. Symbiosis. Now for symbiosis, again, it is a relationship between living organisms whereby we are going to have two organisms, either plants or animals, where they interact and in the process they benefit from each other. So they are interacting, but that interaction is so obligatory such that it is an obligatory relationship, such that one organism cannot stay very far away from the other. In that, if we have an organism A, will be depending on an organism B, but at the same time this organism B will also be benefiting from an organism A. So species A and species B are living in a very close interactive manner, so that it is a must, or it is almost automatic that if you want to get organism A, you look for organism B. Just find the habitat of B, you will get that organism A. Or if you want to get organism B, just look for organism A. So we call that kind of relationship as an obligatory relationship, such that they are benefiting from each other, but it's a very close relationship, a very tight relationship between the two species. So it does not discriminate, such that it is only between plants to plants or animal to animal. It can be animal, plant to plant, or animal to plant. So we call this type of relationship as symbiosis. So we can make a note of the same is a relationship between two organisms, in which both organisms benefit from each other. So we have several relationships in which organisms are benefiting from each other, but this kind of relationship, as we have said, is a very tight, it's a very close relationship, so that one organism must always be closer, cannot stay away from the other. So we say it is a very tight relationship, In other words, i.e., it is an obligatory relationship. So the other organism cannot stay very far from the other. So this relationship, we have said, it could be between animals, between plants, or between animal and plants. The relationship. Could be between plants, animals, or between plants, animals, or plants and animals. Plants and animals. So those organisms that participate in this kind of relationship are called symbionts. These organisms are called symbionts. They are called symbionts. We call them symbionts. So if it is one, sometimes you call it a symbiote. So this is a symbiotic relationship. We want to find out the kind of examples that can qualify our definition. So by illustration, we can have species A and another species B here, just to show that they are benefiting from each other. This provides some resources, and also B provides some resources to A. So there's sharing of resources, so that A is able to give some resources or provide resources to B, and B in turn also provides some resources to A. So here we have resources being exchanged. Now these resources could be some of the resources that will be shared. They are varied. It could be food. You can have food, one providing food for the other, nutrients. You can have shelter being provided, and these are the major ones, and others like conditions in the environment, like forming a base or anchorage points, substratum for growth or for anchorage. So these are the major resources. Although when it comes to nutrients, we can be able to subdivide them into several kind of nutrients. But shelter, we know shelter can also form a breeding site or any other thing. Condition could be in form of maybe water, warmth, forming a habitat, or even a substratum, as we have indicated. So examples of these, examples of symbiotic relationship, examples. So we are going to look at several examples, and one of the most widely studied example of symbiosis are the lichens. So when you talk of a lichen, this is already a composite name or a composite relationship. It means we already have two organisms. So in this, we have two organisms, the blue-green algae, in symbiotic relationship with, let me use and we have fungus or a fungi. So in a lichen symbiotic relationship, we have blue-green algae and fungus, such that the two organisms, the two species, will be benefiting from each other. So the question is, how do they benefit from each other? So briefly, if we have blue green algae and we have fungi or fungus, we want to find out the characteristic of each before we find out how they will benefit from each other. Now blue-green algae, already being green, it has chlorophyll, is able to carry out photosynthesis. And one major product of photosynthesis are carbohydrates. So it leads to anabolic process that synthesizes carbohydrates through photosynthesis. But something else again, during photosynthesis, there is release of oxygen gas. Oxygen gas is formed. Oxygen gas is formed as a byproduct. So we are saying these are the products or resources algae is going to provide: carbohydrates, oxygen from photosynthesis, and now is also going to provide a source or a place for anchorage for fungus. So the fungus will now depend on algae as a place for anchorage. But now fungus in the process is going to use carbohydrates, but as it uses that carbohydrate, is going to undergo, or we are going to have facilitative processes like catabolic reaction that breaks down carbohydrates now into products like carbon dioxide, the other name of carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide is important because it is going to be involved in the green plants or in photosynthesis to form carbohydrates. Also, there will be formation of water due to respiration. So there will be respiration in fungus, the substrate being carbohydrates, and in the process releasing a carbon dioxide and water. But again, also some fungus, because of decomposition or decomposing ability, they may also decompose some materials and in the process release locked nutrients. So mineral ions will be released from organic matter due to decomposition by fungus. So in the process, fungus will provide this material to blue-green algae, and blue-green algae will be providing these resources. So at the end of it, it is getting those resources to fungus, and fungus now provides these resources to algae. So in this relationship, the two organisms are benefiting from each other. And because it's like they're depending on the other for nearly all the materials and resources, this is a very tight relationship. So yeah, that they cannot stay away, or neither of them will stay very far. They must be very close to each other. That's why we are saying symbiotic relationship is an obligatory relationship. The other example is Rhizobium bacteria. Number 2, Rhizobium bacteria and root nodules, or just roots of leguminous plants. Now, leguminous plants include plants like beans, peas, and several others. So we have a bacteria here. Want to find out how the bacteria will help, and then we have the roots or the plant. So this bacteria also has a given character or feature in that it's able to convert free nitrogen in the atmosphere into forms that can be used by plants. Now, we already know that in the atmosphere we have a gas called nitrogen gas, and it makes a very huge percentage of the atmosphere, about 78% of the atmosphere. But it is noted that nitrogen gas cannot be able to participate in most of the biochemical reactions. From other scientific knowledge, nitrogen gas has a triple covalent bond. So because of that, it's not very easy for the bond to be broken to allow it participate in very many biochemical reactions. Therefore, even if the plants are exposed to nitrogen gas, they cannot tap it the way they are going to use carbon dioxide, the way the plants will use oxygen. So it has to be converted in forms that will enable plants use it for purpose of maybe formation of proteins. Remember, nitrogen is a very important element in formation of proteins, in formation of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. Therefore, there must be a way of converting this nitrogen into forms that can be easily be used by the plants. So that form in which the plants can easily use is the nitrogenous compounds, and some of them could be nitrates, could be ammonium compounds. So when you talk of nitrate, it's a salt, like let us say calcium nitrate, sodium nitrate. Ammonium compounds could be sodium nitrate, it could be calcium nitrate, aluminium, it could be maybe magnesium nitrate, something like that. So that process of converting nitrogen gas in the atmosphere to compounds that can be taken by plants, we call it nitrification. Now, for that one to happen, the bacteria are the one that will aid in the conversion of free nitrogen gas to nitrates, to ammonium compounds, so that now they can be used by the plants. So you realize that the bacteria will live inside the roots of leguminous plants in structures called nodules. So these plants will have, if that is a root, at some point we have a swelling. That is a root, and that swelling is called a nodule. So the bacteria will be found in the nodule, so that now they can aid in conversion of nitrogen gas to nitrates that are easily available to plants. That process is called nitrification. So the major role of the bacteria, rhizobium bacteria, in this symbiotic relationship is simply converting nitrogen gas that cannot be used by plants into forms that are available to plants. Now let us find out how plants will be able to benefit, how bacteria benefits. We have already said that the bacteria will be found inside the root nodules. So that is already a benefit to bacteria. So the root nodules is providing a habitat, a shelter for the bacteria. So in other words, bacteria obtains shelter from the plants, or plants provide shelter to the bacteria. Another way in which the plant is useful, remember, plants are able to manufacture their own food. So some of the materials that will be manufactured in leaves, it will be translocated to the roots, And remember, the bacteria is in the roots. So bacteria are also going to benefit of the manufactured food from the leaves. So it provides it with carbohydrates or food. So these are the resources the plant will provide to the bacteria. And these are the resources that the bacteria will provide to the plant. So this is a very clear example of how symbiotic relationship becomes very tight. So that if I want to sample, I want to get samples of Rhizobium bacteria, I don't have to labor so much. What I try to find, I'll try to get the plants, leguminous plants like beans, like peas. I can plant them, and then after they reach maturity, you uproot the roots, and then you just macerate. Maceration means you cut into small pieces the roots, and then you can obtain smears of the same on a glass slide, and then you can be able to observe the Rhizobium bacteria. So they must be very close to each other. So the other example of this, the other example is, example number 3 is mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza again is a collective term. Mycorrhiza is a collective term whereby we have saprophytic fungi or organism, saprophytic fungi in a relationship with roots of coniferous trees. Coniferous trees. But this is slightly different from what we have just looked at, Rhizobium, because the fungi does not live inside the roots, but instead they are going to benefit from each other in several ways. So one way in which saprophytic fungi, it is going to decompose some materials, proteins. So it is a decomposer. So when it decomposes this material, the material will now be free to be used by plants. So minerals. The materials that were locked in organic material have been decomposed, and then they are released into the ecosystem to be absorbed by the roots of the coniferous trees. And then the coniferous trees, being plants, one characteristic of nearly all plants, they carry out photosynthesis, and in the process is going to provide carbohydrates. So these are the resources that saprophytic fungi will be able to get, and at the same time the plants will be able to get mineral ions from decomposition activity of the saprophytic fungi. The other example is ruminants and bacteria in the gut. Number 4, ruminants and bacteria in their gut. So ruminants, these are herbivores. We know that herbivores feed on green vegetable matter. Feed on green vegetable matter. But plant cells, as from basic science, we know that plant cells have double membranes, cell wall. Cell wall is made up of cellulose. So most plants, where one content that is very high in vegetable matter is cellulose. Cellulose cannot be digested in your gut, for example, in human beings. It cannot be digested because we do not have the enzymes to digest those this kind of material. So what happens is that because these are herbivores feeding on vegetation, there will be a problem if there was no means for digestion of cellulose. So bacteria here comes in handy and secretes an enzyme. That enzyme is called cellulase enzyme. So this enzyme will be able to act on cellulose. It digests cellulose into slightly simpler carbohydrates, because cellulose is a poly, or we can say it's a polysaccharide. Therefore, it digests into maltose. Then the digestive system will pick up from there. So bacteria is helping the ruminants to digest cellulose through secretion of enzyme cellulase. In fact, they are called cellulase secreting bacteria. So we have ruminants which are benefiting from bacteria that lives in their digestive system gut, because they are releasing cellulase enzyme to break down cellulose to slightly simpler carbohydrate called maltose, and the digestive process will pick up from there maltose to glucose. But this bacteria is benefiting from the ruminants. How? The ruminants are providing shelter to bacteria, a habitat. So the ruminants provide shelter, but at the same time also, after digesting this material, remember this maltose will be digested to glucose. Glucose is absorbable, can easily be absorbed. Again, it will be used by the bacteria. So maltose, cellulase digested cellulose to maltose, but now bacteria has no ability to digest maltose. Ruminants, the digestive system has enzymes, the maltase, that can now break down maltose to glucose. So in the end, the ruminants will have food or nutrients in form of glucose nutrients. These nutrients will be available for itself, but again it can be used by the bacteria. So in the process, the ruminants will be providing bacteria with shelter and nutrients. Bacteria will be providing cellulase enzyme, which aids in digestion or breakdown of cellulose to maltose. So again, this is a symbiotic relationship in which both the organisms are benefiting from each other. So if you look at it again, as we have used the term tight or a close relationship, if I want to get this cellulase secreting bacteria, all I have to get to is the gut of the ruminants, showing that the bacteria cannot live very far from the ruminants. They must be a very close association. So that's why we are saying it is an obligatory relationship. If I get the ruminant, I have the bacteria. And where the bacteria is, the ruminants are there. So it is a very close relationship. But now the question is, remember, we are looking at these relationships to establish how they affect distribution, abundance, locality, and even species richness. So as we have been able to use several examples, we have found out that wherever there is one organism, one symbiont, there will be also another symbiont, which means one symbiont will always be found where there is an appropriate, where there is the other organism where they can have the relationship playing out. So in other words, symbionts will always be. Symbionts will be found where the other organism where the other organism that they benefit from each other. So if we have organism A and is in symbiotic relationship with B, they will always be found in the same ecosystem, in the same habitat, so that they can be able to benefit from each other. They can maximize the relationship. The other maybe not so very tight relationships include mutualism. But again, it might affect distribution of organisms. Now, in a mutual relationship, we have two organisms, species A and B, or of the same species. They could be of different species or of the same species, where they benefit from each other, just like symbiosis. But the difference is these two organisms can live far from each other. They can do without each other. It's not a must that it depends on the other. So we have looked at cellulose secreting bacteria and ruminants. It's like ruminants cannot survive without cellulose secreting bacteria. That is a symbiotic relationship. But if we have a relationship where there is a male and female of the same species, but they have to come together for purpose of reproduction, just for reproduction, that is mutualism. The other organism can survive, it cannot die. Although as a generation, maybe it can get extinct. But the two organisms, given two habitats, they will survive to their maturity. They may die differently, but they can do without each other. So in mutualism is where two organisms depend on each other, benefit from each other, but they may live without the other. Without the other. In other words, it is non-obligatory. It is a non-obligatory relationship. It is non-obligatory association. We have given an example. Mates usually come together for purpose of reproduction. Sometimes you can also say, especially in human beings, the ape family, for sexual satisfaction. It's not a must that the two organisms should have sex. So example, mates for reproduction. But human beings have displayed a slightly different character just for sex. Sexual satisfaction. Commensalism is also another association or relationship in which we have two organisms, two species, but one of the organisms gains, but the other neither gains nor loses. It's a neutral. It is there in a relationship with another organism. We have species A and species B. So this species A is benefiting species B in some way. So this benefits. It benefits. but A does not benefit in any other way, nor loses. No gain, no loss. So it is just, they are neutral. So we call this one as commensalism. We are going to look at some examples. Is a relationship in which one organism benefits but the other neither benefits nor loses. So illustratively, it's just a two-way, it's a one-way traffic. The other one benefits, but the other one neither loses nor gains. So nothing happens. There's no effect on A. You can give an example of example. We have one. We have a relationship between cattle, especially the one that are in paddocking system, and the egrets. We have birds, white birds called the egrets. These are birds. So it's the egrets that benefits in this relationship. When the cattle is grazing through the field, so what happens? Grassland, in a grassland, what's happening is that the cattle will be disturbing the habitat, and in the process we have some insects that will be exposed. Some of them will jump out of the grass. When that one happens, they'll be exposed to a predator, the egrets, the white birds. That's why you'll find that where we have cattle, where we have, for example, buffaloes, where we have zebras, where we have antelopes. This is very common in tropical African game reserves. You'll see that we have some flock of white birds, so that they're just benefiting from cattle as it disturbs the ecosystem or the habitat. Insects are able to come out. When they come out, they're exposed to them, and in the process they are fed on by the birds. So this one disturbs the habitats, then insects come out, which will be fed on. So these insects, the insects now will be fed on by the egrets. So that's why if I want to get egrets and I don't want to use geographical information systems and any other methods, I just find where we have common herds of herbivores, specifically the grazers, the buffaloes, the cattle. I'll always find the egrets that I'm looking for. So already it is affecting distribution of the egrets. Egrets are found close to the herbivores so that they can benefit from the disturbance of the habitat. The other example, we have a sea animal, a sea organism called sea anemone. It's a small organism with a crab called hermit, the hermit crab. So in this crab, we know that the crab has exoskeleton covering, the carapace covering the surface of the crab. But between the carapace and the tissues of the crab, we have some spaces where very small organisms called sea anemones can be able to hide. So in the process, the hermit crab is going to provide some few resources to the sea anemone. One of them, as we can indicate, if this is a crab, this is just an illustration of the same. It's going to provide shelter, as we have seen, shelter to the sea anemone. Because it's small, it can hide itself under the carapace. Carapace is that hard surface of the crab, the exoskeleton. We call it carapace. So as it is providing the shelter, again, if there was a predator to anemone, there'll be protection. So together with protection. Now in the sea, it is characterized by waves and several other things, so movement becomes a problem. But now the crabs are able to move very easily as compared to the sea anemone. So as it moves from one point to another, it will be carrying with it the sea anemone. So in so doing, it is providing a means of locomotion, movement. So movement. The sea anemone is able to move from one point to another. So these resources will be provided to sea anemone. But the hermit crab is not being harmed. There is nothing happening to the crab, but the sea anemone is benefiting. So if I have to study sea anemone, I'll just harvest some few crabs, and then I'm able to extract the sea anemone and do my studies. So the question of distribution is already being answered here, so that I have to find sea anemone, I'll get the crab, and then just extract the sea anemone. So in all this relationship, we have been trying to find out how does the other organism affect distribution of the other? How do they affect each other? The host disease host, disease host relationship. Now remember, we have disease. Disease is not an organism. Host is an organism. So before we look at it, we have to find out the meaning of disease. We know that disease is when the normal functioning of the body or parts of the body has been impaired. The normal functioning of the body and parts of the body has been impaired. In other words, not functioning normally, has been impaired. So the question is, what causes a disease? Now, in our previous lessons, we were able to come across disease. We said that the disease, we have two types of disease, those that are environmental, but we also have those that are pathogenic, but most of them are caused by pathogens. So these are the organisms. Pathogens are the one that causes diseases. Cause diseases. They are the one that leads to diseases. Pathogens could range from very small organisms to very large organisms, the protozoans. So this include tiny organisms like bacteria, viruses. We have already looked at these viruses, fungi, protozoans, protozoans, and sometimes even very large organisms like tapeworms can lead to impairment of body parts. So it is the relationship between a pathogen and a host. So pathogens will invade the host and in the process cause the disease. Pathogens invade host, and the result is disease. But in fact, nearly all organisms or all hosts of pathogens are diseased. But you realize that this one does not cause most of the time death of the organism. The effects on the host, most common, easily common, is decrease in population. Decrease in population. This one is given. But death can happen, yes, but there must be a balance between host and pathogen. If the host dies, let us say bacteria invades your body and you die. What happens to the bacteria? They depend on your body for several resources like nutrients, a habitat, and the rest, even as reproductive side. So if the host dies, most of the time the pathogen will die if it's not going to be transmitted to another host. Therefore, we need a balance between the host and pathogen. How can that balance be created? The balance is created, emanates from the host. Host will produce some mechanisms that will suppress increase in number of pathogens, or that will prevent invasion into the body by the pathogen. One way in which the host is going to do that is through immune system. Remember, we looked at the immune system. The inflammatory reactions, the immune system, the white blood cells, either through phagocytic or through antibiotic production, is able to fight the pathogen. Therefore, there must be a balance. But the key factor here that we are looking at is how will this pathogen affect the population of the host? It's going to affect the population of the host in two major ways. Decreasing population of the host because it has impaired the normal functioning, like even reproduction. It is not possible for organisms to reproduce when they are sick. A sick flock cannot increase in population. There will be a decrease in population to some level. But severity of pathogenicity to host may cause death of the organism. Death, which lead to complete wiping of the host in that ecosystem. A very good example has been given of the koalas of Australia. Koalas of Australia, there was in the 70s, in the 1780s, the koalas, there was a population explosion, high population of koalas in Australia. But due to a disease, pneumonia, they were invaded. There was an invasion by pneumococcus bacteria. They developed pneumonia, and in the process, the population just dropped. Population dropped. There was a drop in population, drastic population drop. So, in fact, right now there are fewer just because of this pathogenicity or pathogen-host relationship that happened at one time. So, pathogen can affect distribution of disease of the host. Where we have so many of the pathogens, there'll be movement away from that place. There'll be death there will be decrease in population, and sometimes it may lead to migration of organisms to other ecosystems, especially for human beings. If there is an outbreak of a disease in an area and it's not possible to control, some people will move away from that area, especially if they are not infected, so that they can go to other areas where they are more safe. So with that, we can go through some few questions just to gauge our understanding of the same. So one of the questions is, define the following. So we have symbiosis, we have mutualism, we have commensalism. Symbiosis, mutualism, and commensalism. Now for symbiosis, we have already been able to define it very clearly, but for purpose of emphasis and getting it even clearer, we have said symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms where the two organisms benefit from each other. Both benefit. But the two organisms cannot live away from the other. Two organisms cannot live away from each other. Now, because of this, we were able to come up with the term obligatory relationship. We said this is an obligatory relationship. We gave several examples, but the one that you cannot easily forget is that one of rhizobium and the root nodules of leguminous plants, the peas, the beans. And then we have mutualism. It's just the same as symbiosis, but it is not obligatory in that one of the organisms can move away from the other, but it still survives. So a relationship in which both organisms benefit from each other. But one may live away from each other. So if you use a very good example, a very common example, marriage. Marriage is a mutual relationship. It's not a must that a wife and a husband must stick together. If they go separate ways, none of them will die. They will continue surviving. Snivo, madam. See, commensalism. Commensalism, we have said, we have two organisms, but one gains, but the other neither loses nor gains. One gains. The other organism neither gains nor loses. So we gave good example, the hermit crab and the sea anemone. Question 2, you can also look at this, define the following. One is disease. So we have said disease is impairment. Is impairment of the body parts or the whole body, thus leading to that interferes with the normal functioning of the body. Impairment of body or of parts of the body. Body or parts of the body leading to interfered functioning. Functioning of the body. In other words, if it is the respiratory system, if it's going to be infected, like pneumonia, it usually affects the lungs. If the lungs are infected, then the breathing movements or the breathing mechanism, gas exchange mechanism is going to be affected. If it is digestive system, if there's a blockage in the digestive system, food cannot be able to pass through it. That is a disease. Then 2, pathogen. Pathogen. Pathogen, we have said, is an organism that causes disease. It's the one that leads to impairment. So we have different kind of pathogens, as we are able to mention: bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoans. Question 3. The Australian quarantine and inspection. The Australian quarantine and inspection service IQIS inspects all goods, all goods and organisms brought in and out, and organisms brought in and out of Australia. So the question is, part A, name some prohibited items. Name some prohibited items. Those items that are not allowed, prohibited items that cannot be brought into Australia. So these are goods and organisms. So why should they do this? The first thing is that maybe the goods and organisms could be, if they are goods, they are infected, they are contaminated with pathogens. Therefore, if they are brought into Australia, they may spread the disease from the area or the source from where they were brought from. And some organisms may be pathogenic to native organisms, and especially animals and plants. So we look at some of them. Most of them are in form of foods. So foodstuffs such as eggs could be contaminated with diseases. Fruits, milk, even beef. Those are some of the example. So it could be foodstuffs, it could be plants, it could be plants, or it could be plants or animals, live animals and plants, live animals and plants, plant parts, e.g. cuttings. We have roots, we have stems. If they are brought, maybe the animals or plants are infected with diseases. So in the process, they are going to affect the native organisms. Then you also have inanimate material like sand. If you bring in sand from other areas, it will be inspected. Sand, soil, packing materials. Packing materials like cotton and straws. They have to be inspected to find out if they have they are contaminated with pathogens. So this kind of materials, they can import, yes, food, live animals, but upon very serious scrutiny and be able to establish if they are infected or not. So we still have other questions that we shall be able to complete in our next lesson, just to be very clear on disease-host relationships. So thank you for being attentive.